Alright, let's go. Number 10. Bog butter. In 2016, a turf cutter working Emlog Bog in County Meath, Ireland, drove his blade into the peat and struck something that was not peat. What came out of the ground weighed roughly 22 pounds. It was pale, waxy, and dense, wrapped in nothing at all, sitting nearly 4 meters down in black saturated ground. Analysis dated it to approximately 2,000 years ago. It was butter, and it was, technically speaking, still edible. This was not an isolated curiosity. Across Ireland and Scotland, farmers and peat cutters have pulled more than 500 separate deposits of ancient dairy fat out of the bogs. They come up in carved wooden kegs, in containers of stripped bark, in bags stitched from animal hide. Some are the size of a fist, others are the size of a barrel. The dates span an extraordinary range, from the Bronze Age through the medieval period, with the oldest examples approaching 3,000 years. This is not a single strange event in the archaeological record. It is a practice, sustained across 3 millennia, by generation after generation of people who decided that the correct place to put butter was in the ground. The bog is why any of it survived. Peat bogs are cold, intensely acidic, and almost entirely without oxygen. The bacteria that dismantle organic matter cannot function in that environment. Decay does not slow down in a bog. Decay stops. What happens instead is a chemical transformation. The fat gradually converts into a waxy, soap-like substance chemically comparable to adipocere, the grave wax that forms on human corpses submerged in cold, anaerobic conditions. The same process that turns a body into a pale, soft mannequin in a flooded grave turns a keg of dairy fat into something that will outlast the church that was built above it. The numbers are worth sitting with. 3,000 years of continuous burial, 500 recovered deposits, which represents only what happened to surface during industrial peat extraction and casual farm work, meaning the true figure beneath Irish and Scottish ground is unknowable and almost certainly enormous. And a substance that has survived the entire span of recorded Irish history without a refrigerator, a preservative, or a container that could hold a seal. But here's where the material stops being a curiosity and becomes something else. Bog butter is not inert, it has a smell. Excavators who have opened these containers describe the same thing with remarkable consistency. A pungent, sharply cheesy, rancid milk stink that fills an entire room within seconds of the lid coming off. Not a faint archaeological trace, not a chemical signature detectable by instrument, a stench that clears a laboratory. The colors range from chalky grayish-white to a dull yellow, and the texture crumbles under a thumbnail like old candle wax. It looks like something scraped off the inside of a drain. It smells like a dairy that failed 2,000 years ago. And on some samples, pressed into the surface where the fat was packed down into its container, there are fingerprints. Hand marks. The impressions of the individual who made it, kneeling at the edge of a bog with an armful of butter, pressing it flat. Why they did it remains unsettled. One argument holds that the bog was simply a refrigerator, a reliable cold store in a landscape without one. Another proposes tax evasion, wealth and fat hidden from whoever was counting it. A third reads the deposits as votive offerings, food given deliberately and permanently to the bog itself, the same wet ground into which Iron Age communities across northern Europe were also placing weapons, jewelry, and people. The 3 explanations are not mutually exclusive. Some of these deposits were probably lunch. Some were probably a gift to something the depositor believed was listening. What remains is the oldest human food anyone alive can still smell. The people who churned it are gone. Their language is gone, their settlements have dissolved into the same peat, their names were never written down because writing had not arrived. But the butter is in a museum case in Dublin, greasy and gray and still faintly reeking, holding the fingerprints of a person who has otherwise left no trace of having existed at all. Number 9. Prehistoric chewing gum. On the west coast of Sweden, at a Mesolithic site called Ötzi Cladh, archaeologists recovered dozens of small blackish lumps of birch bark pitch from sediment that had been sealed beneath clay for the better part of 10,000 years. The lumps were unremarkable to look at. Thumb-sized, glossy, tacky as road tar, smelling faintly of wood smoke and creosote. What made them extraordinary was the surface. Pressed into each one were tooth impressions, the cusps sunk in as crisply as bite marks in fresh toffee. Somebody had chewed them and spat them out. Between 9,700 and 10,000 years ago, birch bark pitch was the adhesive of the Stone Age. Strips of bark were dry heated until they wept a thick black tar, and that tar was used to fix stone points into wooden shafts and bind blades into handles. The problem with tar is that it hardens. To keep it workable, somebody had to chew it. Not for pleasure, not for flavor, as labor. In the saliva soaked into 3 of those lumps, researchers recovered human DNA. 3 separate individuals, distinguishable from one another, identified from spit that had dried on a workshop floor before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth. The tooth marks on some of the pitch are small. Small enough that the chewing appears to have been done, at least in part, by children and teenagers. The workshop's grunt labor, jaws working the tar soft, while the adults did the assembly. 10,000 years ago, a child sat somewhere on a Swedish shoreline, chewing tar for hours so that someone else could hunt. But here's where the material stops being a curiosity and becomes something closer to a body. At Siltholm, in Denmark, excavators recovered a single wad of chewed pitch dating to approximately 5,700 years ago. It was nicknamed Lola. From that one discarded lump, no skeleton, no grave, no burial goods, no bones of any kind, geneticists extracted a complete human genome. The person who chewed it was a woman. Her DNA indicates dark skin, dark hair, and blue eyes, the same striking combination found in other Western European hunter-gatherers of the period. She was lactose intolerant, like nearly everyone alive at that moment in human history. She left no remains. She left saliva stuck to tar, and from that alone we can describe her face. The gum held more than her. Trapped in the same lump were fragments of hazelnut DNA and mallard duck DNA, the residue of what she had eaten shortly before putting the pitch in her mouth. A meal, recovered 5,700 years later, from the inside of somebody's cheek, and it held her infections. The pitch preserved Porphyromonas gingivalis, the bacterium associated with gum disease, and it preserved Epstein-Barr virus, the pathogen responsible for glandular fever. A virus recovered from dried spit, from a woman who has been dead since before the first stone was laid at Stonehenge. What makes this particularly unsettling is the completeness of it. Archaeology is built on scarcity. We reconstruct entire populations from a handful of teeth and a scatter of flint. Here, a single piece of discarded chewing gum produced a full portrait: ancestry, pigmentation, diet, oral microbiome, active viral infection. More information than most burials yield. More than most cemeteries yield. She has no name. Lola is a label applied by researchers, taken from the nearby locality. She has no grave, no monument, no descendants we can trace, no context beyond the mud she was found in. There is no evidence she was mourned, or that anyone recorded she had lived at all. Everything we will ever know about her exists because she got bored, or tired, or finished the job, and threw a lump of tar on the ground. The pitch is still there, in laboratory storage, glossy and black and dented with the shape of a Stone Age mouth. The tooth marks have not softened, the saliva has not fully surrendered its cargo, and in the impressions left in that tar, a woman who was never buried, never named, and never meant to be remembered, continues to describe herself in detail to strangers who arrived 6,000 years too late to ask. Number 8. 48,000-year-old Neanderthal dental plaque. In the caves of El Cedrón in northern Spain and Spy Cave in Belgium, archaeologists recovered the teeth of individuals who died roughly 48,000 years ago. The teeth themselves were unremarkable. What clung to them was not. Cemented along the gum line in thick bands, beige in places and near black in others, sat a mineral crust as hard as limescale in an old kettle. Dental calculus, hardened plaque, the fossilized residue of tens of thousands of unbrushed days. For most of the history of the discipline, that crust was an obstacle. It obscured wear patterns. It had to be cleaned off before the tooth could be properly studied. Technicians scraped it away and discarded it. An entire generation of Neanderthal research was conducted by throwing the most informative substance on the skeleton into the bin. Because plaque does something no other tissue does. It mineralizes in living time, layer over layer, trapping whatever passes through the mouth and sealing it in stone. Food particles, bacterial DNA, pollen, smoke. Every meal leaves a fraction of itself behind, entombed in calcium phosphate, waiting. In 2017, a team led by Laura Wyrick at the University of Adelaide published an analysis of that trapped material in Nature. The results rewrote what Neanderthals were assumed to have eaten. The individual from Spy Cave in Belgium had lived on meat. Heavily, relentlessly on meat. Woolly rhinoceros, wild sheep. The plaque carried the genetic signatures of both, alongside mushrooms, an animal-dominated diet consistent with a cold, open steppe landscape where large grazing mammals were the only reliable calories available. That fit the stereotype perfectly, the brutish carnivore of the northern winter. Then they sequenced the plaque from El Cedrón. There was no rhinoceros, no large game at all. The Spanish Neanderthals had been eating pine nuts, moss, mushrooms, and tree bark. Two populations of the same species, separated by roughly 1,300 kilometers, ate diets with almost nothing in common. Neanderthals were not one thing. They adapted their subsistence to whatever the landscape offered, which is precisely what modern humans do. But here's where the plaque stops describing dinner and starts describing suffering. One of the El Cedrón individuals was sick. The jawbone preserves a dental abscess, a pocket of infection eating into the bone beside the tooth root, the kind of pain that dominates every waking hour and makes eating an ordeal. His calculus contained the DNA of poplar. Poplar bark carries salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin. The same crust also held traces of penicillium mold, an analgesic and an antibiotic-producing fungus, in the mouth of a man with a rotting jaw, 48,000 years ago. The finding does not prove intent. Poplar could have been chewed for other reasons. Mold could have grown on stored food. But the correlation sits there, uncomfortable and unresolved, on the teeth of the one individual in the deposit who had a reason to seek relief. Somewhere in that cave, a creature we spent a century depicting as a shambling brute may have been medicating a toothache with the ancestors of aspirin and penicillin, tens of thousands of years before either was named. The plaque yielded more. Sealed inside it were the microbes of the Neanderthal mouth, including Methanobrevibacter oralis, reconstructed into the oldest microbial genome ever recovered from a human relative. An entire ecosystem, invisible and unrecorded, preserved because it happened to live in the wrong place at the wrong time and got buried in stone by its own host. And the teeth carry one more detail: grooves, fine, worn channels along the surfaces between molars, cut by something rigid, used repeatedly in the same spot. Habitual toothpicking. They appear most often beside gums that show evidence of chronic infection and inflammation, which means the picking was not grooming. It was an attempt to relieve pain. That is the portrait the filth returns. Not a monster, a person with an abscess, working at his gums with a twig, chewing bark that dulled the ache, eating mushrooms and bark and pine nuts in a Spanish cave, while 1,000 kilometers north, his cousins gnawed rhinoceros. Their bones told us almost nothing about any of that. Their tartar told us everything. Their filth is our archive, and it survived for one reason only. Nobody thought it was worth cleaning off. Number 7. Inside Ötzi the Iceman. In September 1991, two hikers crossing a melting ice field in the Ötztal Alps near the Italian-Austrian border saw a human head and shoulders protruding from the slush. They assumed they had found a lost climber. What they had found was a man who died 5,300 years ago and had been frozen into the mountain ever since, his skin intact, his clothing scattered around him, his copper axe still lying where it fell. He is the most thoroughly examined human being from prehistory. Not a skeleton, not a scatter of teeth and calculus. A complete person, organs included. The condition of the body is difficult to overstate. Glacial ice had freeze-dried him, drawing the skin tight and leather brown over the bone, preserving hair, tissue, blood vessels, and the soft contents of a digestive tract that has now been read from one end to the other. Researchers have mapped 61 tattoos across his body, arranged in lines and crosses. They have imaged his joints, his teeth, his arteries. They have identified gallstones. They have recovered DNA from the sediment of his gut. And for nearly 2 decades, they missed his stomach entirely. The freezing process had shoved the organ upward, jammed beneath the rib cage where anatomy said it should not be, and every early scan overlooked it. When it was finally located and opened, it was full. A dark, greasy paste, undigested, sitting exactly where it had been when the man stopped living. The last meal of a Copper Age European, still recognizable as food. The composition is startling. Roughly half the calories came from fat. not lean protein, not grain, fat, most of it from ibex, eaten alongside ibex meat, red deer meat, and einkorn wheat. There were also traces of bracken fern, a plant that is genuinely toxic. Whether he swallowed it as medicine, as wrapping for his provisions, or by accident, nobody can say. He ate the meal perhaps an hour before an arrow entered his left shoulder and severed an artery. He was eating, and then he was bleeding out on a mountain pass, and the ice took him with breakfast still in his stomach. But here's where the romantic image of the prehistoric wilderness man collapses entirely. Ötzi was not a hardened alpine survivor at the peak of his powers. He was sick. His large intestine contained the eggs of whipworm, Trichuris trichiura, an intestinal parasite that colonizes the gut and stays there. Under the microscope, the eggs are lemon-shaped, barrel-ended, plugged at both poles, unmistakable and abundant. He was carrying a live infestation when he died. His stomach lining carried Helicobacter pylori, the ulcer bacterium, and not a mild variant, a notably virulent strain, the kind associated with gastric inflammation and pain. The list continues. His arteries were calcified, hardened with deposits, the signature of cardiovascular disease in a man who spent his life walking mountains and eating wild game. His joints were worn. He had gallstones. His DNA yielded Borrelia, sequences indicating exposure to Lyme disease, and one of his fingernails, recovered from the ice, carried a series of transverse grooves, the marks a nail makes when the body diverts resources away from growth during illness. The nail recorded repeated bouts of sickness across his final months. It is a medical chart written in keratin. Assemble the pieces, and the portrait that emerges is not heroic. A man in his mid-40s, arthritic, ulcerated, worm-ridden, with heart disease and a fat-saturated last meal in his belly, climbing to over 3,000 meters of altitude in the Alps, and taking an arrow between the shoulder blades. He was ill, and he was fleeing, and someone caught him. What makes Otzi particularly unsettling is not that he was murdered, it is that the murder is almost incidental to what the body says. The disease was already there. The parasites were already there. The arteries were already narrowing. Whoever loosed that arrow simply ended a life that was, by every internal measure, already grinding down. He is now held at a constant -6 degrees Celsius in a refrigerated cell in Bolzano, sprayed periodically with sterile water to maintain a coating of ice. The man who died on a glacier is still on a glacier, and researchers are still reading him. Number 6. The oldest human excrement on Earth. At El Salt, an open-air site in Alicante, Spain, researchers analyzing sediment from a Neanderthal campsite found something no one had thought to look for. Not bone, not tools, not hearth charcoal. Chemistry. Locked into 50,000-year-old dirt were fecal biomarkers, the molecular fingerprints left behind when a human body processes food and voids the remainder. It is the oldest known human excrement on Earth, and it survives not as an object, but as a stain in the soil, a chemical shadow of a single, unremarkable moment in a Neanderthal's day. The molecules told a story the bones could not. Coprostanol, a breakdown product of cholesterol produced in the mammalian gut, appeared in quantities that proved these individuals were eating meat, and eating a great deal of it. But alongside it sat plant-derived stanols, the residue of vegetable matter passing through the same digestive tract. For decades, the popular image of the Neanderthal was a hyper-carnivore, a creature of red meat and marrow and nothing else. The dirt disagreed. They ate plants. The evidence was in the ground the entire time, invisible to every excavation that had ever swept past it. Then there is Oregon. The Paisley Caves sit in the high desert of south-central Oregon, a set of dry rock shelters that have been slowly filling with dust for tens of thousands of years. Buried in that dust, sealed away from moisture and bacteria, archaeologists recovered desiccated human feces. Radiocarbon dating placed them at approximately 14,300 years old. That single number detonated one of the longest-running arguments in American archaeology, because it is older than Clovis. Older than the fluted spear points that were supposed to mark the arrival of the first people on the continent. Older than the entire framework that had governed the peopling of the Americas for the better part of a century. The specimens themselves are profoundly unglamorous. Dusty gray-brown, light as pumice, crumbling at the edges, some of them still holding their original coiled shape after 14 millennia in the dark. Under a microscope, they resolve into a compacted mash of seed husks, coarse hair, and splinters of bone. Because they dried rather than rotted, their internal structure survived intact. Nothing collapsed, nothing decomposed. Everything that entered the digestive tract of an Ice Age human being was still arranged, layer by layer, in the order it had been swallowed. And the contents are a meal-by-meal record: seeds from desert plants, hair, fragments of bone cracked small enough to pass through a human gut. In at least one case, the remains of an entire rodent, eaten whole. This is not a diet reconstructed from statistical averages or isotope ratios. It is a specific list of what a specific person put in their mouth on a specific afternoon, more than 2,000 years before the culture that was supposed to have arrived first. But here's where the material stops being a curiosity and becomes evidence in the strictest legal sense. The Paisley coprolites contained human mitochondrial DNA, and the lineages recovered from them match those found in modern Native American populations. Not contamination from a later occupant, not animal DNA misread, human genetic material belonging to founding maternal lineages of the Americas, preserved in the least respected substance a human body produces, deposited on a cave floor and left alone for 14,000 years. The laboratory work required to read them carries its own indignity. To be analyzed properly, the material has to be rehydrated in a chemical solution, softened back toward the state it was in when it left the body. Researchers who have done this work report the same thing, consistently. The smell comes back. 14,000 years of desiccation undone in a beaker, and the room fills with the odor of a meal eaten during the last ice age. Monuments were built to be remembered. Tombs were sealed with the expectation that someone would eventually open them. This was not. This was waste, discarded in the corner of a shelter by someone with no conception that anyone would ever look at it again, and it now carries more weight in the argument over who first walked into the Americas than any spear point ever pulled from the ground. It is still there, in climate-controlled storage, cataloged and numbered. The most private thing a human being leaves behind, preserved better than their bones. Number 5. The Cladh Hallan composites. In the 1990s, on the low sandy machair of South Uist, in Scotland's Outer Hebrides, archaeologists, excavating a Bronze Age settlement at Cladh Hallan, lifted the floors of a row of stone roundhouses and found people underneath them. Not scattered bone, not disturbed earlier graves. Complete bodies, buried in shallow pits directly beneath where families had slept and cooked and eaten, somewhere between 1500 and 1000 BC. The bodies were tightly flexed, knees jammed against the chest, arms folded in, the whole figure compressed into a bundle no larger than a big dog. They had been bound that way. A corpse left to itself does not hold that posture. The muscles slacken, the joints open, the limbs fall. To bury a body folded that tightly, someone has to tie it, and someone has to tie it while it still bends. That was the first problem. The second was the bone itself. Analysis of the skeletons showed that the outer surfaces had been demineralized. The calcium leached and softened in a distinctive pattern that does not occur in sandy Hebridean soil. It occurs in peat. Acidic, oxygen-starved, waterlogged peat. The same chemistry that tans a bog body's skin to leather. The bone chemistry allowed researchers to estimate the exposure with unnerving precision. The corpses had been placed in a bog for roughly 6 to 18 months, long enough for the acid to bite into the bone and halt decay entirely, not long enough to dissolve the skeleton. That is not an accident. That is a recipe. Somebody knew exactly how long a body needed to stay in the groundwater before it stopped rotting, and somebody went back and pulled it out. Because the bodies did not stay in the bog. They were retrieved, dried, and kept, and they were not buried beneath the roundhouse floors until centuries afterward. The gap between death and burial spans generations. These corpses were removed from the natural world, preserved by deliberate chemistry, and then carried through the daily life of a community for hundreds of years before anyone put them in the ground. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely impossible. When the skeletons were laid out and examined piece by piece, they did not belong to individual people. The burial identified as male is not a man, it is 3 men. The skull came from one individual, the jaw from a second, and the torso from a third, and radiocarbon dating separated their deaths by several hundred years. 3 corpses, generations apart, assembled into one body, and buried as though it had always been one body. The burial identified as female is likewise a composite, built from parts of more than one person, and one of the components is a male jaw fitted into a female skull. These are not excavation errors. Bones do not migrate through undisturbed floor deposits and reassemble themselves into anatomical order. Someone selected the pieces. Someone matched a skull to a jaw that had spent centuries in a different body, arranged a torso beneath them, folded the assembly into position, and bound it. And in the male's lower jaw, 2 teeth had been deliberately removed. They were not lost, not discarded. One had been placed in each of his hands. What makes Cladh Hallan particularly disturbing is not the violence, because there is no evidence of violence. It is the care. The bog immersion was timed. The retrieval was planned. The curation lasted longer than most modern nations have existed. And at the end of it, a Bronze Age community sat down with a collection of preserved human remains from different centuries and built an ancestor that had never lived. A person constructed from spare parts, given hands and something to hold in them, and installed beneath the floor of a house where people would walk over him every day. Whoever they were commemorating was a fiction, a lineage made physical, a claim to the land assembled out of the actual bodies of the dead, and treated as though it were a single man. The bones lie in Scottish collections now, catalogued as separate individuals, their false anatomy taken apart again by the people who found it. The community that assembled them left no writing, no name, and no explanation, only the mismatched joints and 2 teeth that were placed, on purpose, into the palms of a man who never had them. Number 4. The Chinchorro mummies. In 1917, the German archaeologist Max Uhle excavated a series of burials in the sand near Arica, on the desert coast of northern Chile, and pulled from the ground a set of human figures that did not behave like corpses. They were rigid. Their faces were blank, molded, expressionless surfaces of clay. Their bodies were painted, and they were older than anything comparable anywhere on the planet. The Chinchorro were fisher-gatherers. They built no cities, raised no monuments, wrote nothing down, and left behind no pyramids. What they left behind were their dead, artificially preserved by around 5000 BC, roughly 2,000 years before the earliest Egyptian mummies. The oldest deliberate mummification tradition on Earth was not invented by a state with armies of embalmers and centuries of accumulated theology. It was invented by a small coastal community that lived on shellfish and sea lion, in one of the driest deserts in the world, and it began while most of humanity was still working out agriculture. The method was not preservation, it was reconstruction. The technique archaeologists call the black mummy began with total disassembly. The head was removed, the skin was peeled off in sections and set aside. The organs were extracted, the brain removed, the flesh stripped from the frame, and the bones scraped clean, sometimes dried with hot ash to drive out the last of the moisture. What remained was a skeleton, taken apart and cleaned like tackle after a fishing trip. Then they built the person back. The bones were reassembled on a reinforcing armature of sticks, a wooden skeleton inside the human one. The body's lost volume was packed out with grass, ash, animal hair, and clay paste, until the shape of a living torso returned. The original skin, the person's own skin, was stitched back on over the rebuilt frame. Where there was not enough of it, the gaps were patched with sea lion hide. A clay mask was fitted over the face. The whole figure was then painted with black manganese pigment until it gleamed. Later generations changed the recipe rather than abandoning it. The red mummies were gutted through incisions rather than fully dismembered, stuffed to restore their volume, painted with red ochre, and topped with wigs of human hair fixed in place with clay. Different pigment, different degree of surgery, identical intention. The dead were not to be laid to rest. They were to be finished. But here is where the practice becomes genuinely difficult to sit with. A striking proportion of the Chinchorro mummies are not adults. They are infants, newborns, in some cases miscarried fetuses, bodies that had never drawn breath, taken apart, scraped, armatured, packed, stitched, masked and painted, with the same full ritual applied to a grown man. Someone opened a stillbirth, removed what little was inside it, rebuilt it on sticks, and gave it a face. This was not a burial rite reserved for the important. It was a technology applied to everyone, and it ran for thousands of years. The mummies were not buried and forgotten either. They were kept. Doll stiff figures, with glossy black or brick-red surfaces, blank molded faces, mouths sometimes held open, hair still lying thick and dark on the scalp. They were repainted and repaired across generations, which means they stood among the living, handled and maintained, presences rather than remains. An entire community sharing its coastline with several centuries of its own reconstructed ancestors. The truly disturbing aspect is what is happening to them now. For 7,000 years, the Atacama's absolute aridity held them intact. In recent decades, rising humidity along the northern Chilean coast has changed that. In 2015, researchers including microbiologist Ralph Mitchell at Harvard University, working with Chilean colleagues, identified the cause of an accelerating degradation in the collections at Arica. Ordinary skin bacteria, dormant for millennia, had begun to feed. The ancient skin is liquefying. Specimens that survived the invention of writing, the pyramids, the Roman Empire, and the entire span of recorded history are turning into black ooze in their display cases. The oldest mummies on Earth are going bad. 7,000 years of desert did what no embalmer could improve on, and a few percentage points of atmospheric moisture is undoing all of it. The Chinchorro built their dead to last forever. They very nearly succeeded. Number 3. The bog bodies of Denmark, the murdered men whose faces survived. In May 1950, two brothers cutting peat in the Bjeldskövdal bog near Silkeborg in central Jutland uncovered a man lying on his side in the wet moss, knees drawn up, eyes closed, a leather cord around his throat. They stopped digging and called the police. What they had found was not a recent killing. It was a man who had died roughly 2,000 years earlier and whose face had survived so completely that the people standing over him assumed they were looking at a fresh corpse. The bogs of northern Europe are chemical accidents of extraordinary precision. They are cold, acidic, and almost entirely without oxygen. Sphagnum moss releases compounds that tan human skin the way an artisan tans hide, converting flesh into something closer to leather than to tissue. At the same time, the acid dissolves the calcium out of bone. The result inverts everything we expect from a burial. The skeleton, the part that normally endures for millennia, goes soft and collapses. The skin, the hair, the stubble on the jaw, the eyelashes, the whorled ridges of the fingertips, all of it stays. In a bog, the perishable parts of a human being outlast the permanent ones. Tollund man still wore the plaited leather noose that hanged him, knotted tight and left in place. His expression was composed, almost peaceful, the eyes and mouth gently closed, as though someone had arranged his features after death. 2 years later, in 1952, peat cutters at Gough, less than 20 kilometers away, pulled a second man out of the ground. His throat had been cut in a single deep slash, running from ear to ear, severing the gullet entirely. His hair, stained a vivid coppery red by the bog acids, was still on his head. His hands were so intact that investigators recorded his fingerprints. Not a skeleton, not a reconstruction, a set of fingerprints from a murder victim who died in roughly the 3rd century BC. But here is where the preservation stops being remarkable and becomes genuinely disturbing. The bog did not only keep their faces, it kept the insides of their intestines. Tollund man's final meal was recovered intact, a porridge of barley, flax, and pale persicaria, a coarse gruel of gathered seeds, eaten some hours before the rope went around his neck, and distributed through that gruel, preserved with the same indifferent thoroughness, were the eggs of whipworm, roundworm, and tapeworm. He was heavily parasitized. The man who was walked into a bog and hanged had been carrying a substantial population of intestinal worms while he ate his last breakfast, and both the breakfast and the worms are still there, catalogued, counted, published. Gough man's gut told a stranger story. His gruel contained more than 60 separate plant species, an inventory of foraged seeds far broader than ordinary subsistence would require. Among the residue were traces of ergo, the fungus that grows on damp grain and produces convulsions, burning sensations, and hallucinations in anyone who consumes it. That finding prompted a suggestion that has been argued over ever since, that he was drugged before his throat was opened, or poisoned in the attempt, or that the ergot was simply the ordinary contamination of a bad harvest year. The debate has not been settled and probably cannot be. What makes these men particularly unsettling is not the violence, Violence is ordinary in prehistory. It is the intimacy of the record. Their skin is the color and texture of a well-used saddle, wrinkled and glossy, the features flattened by the weight of tons of accumulated peat pressing down across 20 centuries. In the room where they are stored, there is a strong, sour, earthy smell of wet moss and tannin. It is possible to lean over a display case in Denmark and count the individual bristles of stubble on the chin of a man who was executed before Rome had an empire, then turn to a laboratory report and read the recipe of the meal he was fed beforehand. They are not artifacts of a culture. They are witnesses, and they are still lying there in the low light, throats open, nooses on, saying nothing at all about who put them in the ground. Number 2. The skull cups of Gough's cave. In a limestone cavern at the foot of Cheddar Gorge in Somerset, England, excavators recovered the scattered remains of at least 5 human beings, one of them a child of about 3 years old. The bones date to roughly 14,700 years ago, deep in the Magdalenian, when Britain was a cold peninsula of continental Europe and reindeer still moved through the valleys. The remains were not laid out. They were not arranged in graves. They were mixed into the cave floor, alongside the butchered bones of horse and red deer, processed with the same tools, in the same way, at the same time. 3 of the skulls had been worked. The modification was not casual damage. The faces had been removed. The jaws had been detached. The base of each cranium had been chipped away with controlled percussion, blow after deliberate blow, until only the dome of the vault remained. Then the broken edges were retouched, smoothed, refined into a continuous rim. The result is a bowl, pale, ivory-colored, roughly the size of a small mixing basin, with an evenness of rim that no accident of trampling or predation can produce. These are the oldest known skull cups anywhere in the world. The rest of the assemblage is worse. Around 42% of the human bones from the cave bear human tooth marks, not carnivore punctures, not the crushing signature of hyena or wolf. Chewing damage, crushing damage, and puncture marks identical in form and placement to the marks on the animal bone recovered from the same layers by the same analysts. Ribs had been cracked open. Long bones had been smashed for marrow, the shafts broken in the efficient way a person breaks a bone when they want what is inside it. Cut marks on a jawbone indicate that the tongue had been removed. The bodies were disarticulated, defleshed, and consumed with the practiced competence of people who did this often enough to be good at it. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Cannibalism in the archaeological record is almost always explained away as desperation, famine, a hard winter, a starving band with nothing left but each other. That explanation requires haste, and haste leaves a signature. Rushed cuts, wasted meat, no interest in the container the body came in. Gough's cave shows the opposite. Someone spent considerable time turning 3 human skulls into functional vessels, and the work is skilled enough that the technique can be reconstructed step by step. Starving people do not stop to finish a rim. And then there is the radius. 1 human forearm bone from the cave carries a deliberately engraved zigzag design, cut into the surface in a repeating pattern, framed on either side by butchery marks. The sequence is legible. The arm was defleshed. The bone was then decorated. The decoration is the same kind of geometric motif found on portable art objects across Magdalenian Europe. Someone treated a dead person's arm as a surface worth marking. What makes Gough's cave particularly disturbing is that every element points in the same direction at once. The consistency of the skull modification across 3 individuals, the completeness of the butchery, the engraved bone, the presence of a small child processed exactly as the adults were. This was not an emergency. It was a procedure, a repeated, formalized, transmitted funerary practice in which the dead were eaten and their heads were made into cups. The implications extend further than the cave. These people were anatomically modern humans, biologically identical to anyone alive today, recolonizing Britain as the ice retreated. Their descendants are the population from which later European prehistory grew. Whatever the ritual meant, whatever the cups were used to drink, the practice was normal to them. Reverence and consumption were not opposites. The bones are held in London now, catalogued and stable, the tooth marks still crisp under raking light, the ovals of human incisors pitted into surfaces that once belonged to a family. The rims of the skull cups remain smooth. Somebody made them smooth on purpose, 14,500 years ago, and left no record of why beyond the object itself. Number 1. The Cowboy Wash coprolite. In the 1990s, archaeologists excavating Site 5MT1010 in Cowboy Wash, southwestern Colorado, opened a small ancestral Pueblo hamlet that had been sitting undisturbed in the high desert for 8 centuries. It was not a monumental site, a handful of dwellings, a few pit structures dug into the earth, the ordinary architecture of a farming family living at the edge of the Colorado Plateau. What they found inside those rooms would produce one of the most bitterly disputed conclusions in American archaeology. Around AD 1150, 7 people died there, not buried, not laid out, dismembered. The bones were scattered across the floors of the dwellings, mixed into the occupation debris where people had cooked and slept. The skeletal evidence was unambiguous in its mechanics. Cut marks where flesh had been separated from bone, long bones broken open along their shafts, surfaces scorched by direct exposure to heat. The bodies had been processed with the same sequence of actions used on game animals, in the same rooms where the family had lived. Some of the fragments carried something more specific: pot polish, the glassy sheen that bone acquires when it is stirred repeatedly against the interior wall of a clay vessel over a long simmer. Bone does not develop that surface by accident. It develops it inside a cooking pot, over time, in liquid, while somebody tends the fire. Residue analysis of a cooking pot recovered from the site found human myoglobin, a protein carried in muscle tissue. Human flesh had been stewed in it. But here's where the case moves from inference to something that cannot be argued away. Investigators tested a human coprolite, a preserved stool, left in a cold hearth in one of the abandoned pit structures. It also tested positive for human myoglobin. Myoglobin is not produced in the human gut. It does not appear in digestive waste through contamination of the ordinary kind, and it does not survive digestion unless it entered the body as food. The conclusion, published in Nature in 2000, was as direct as archaeological conclusions ever get. Someone had eaten a person and then defecated in the family's fireplace, in the hollow at the center of the home where the fire was kept, before the site was abandoned. Butchered bone can be debated for decades. Cut marks have alternative explanations. Secondary burial practices, witchcraft executions, mortuary processing, the disarticulation of enemies without consumption. Every one of those arguments has been made, and made seriously, by researchers who have spent careers on the Southwest. A stool containing human muscle protein removes the ambiguity. The evidence and the disgust are the same object. The interpretation remains contested. Pueblo descendant communities dispute both the reading of the evidence and the way it has been publicized, and that objection carries weight, because these are their ancestors, and the framing of an entire people around a single hearth in a single hamlet is a distortion in itself. The debate over what happened at Cowboy Wash, and what it meant, and who did it, has not closed and may never close. What is undisputed is the violence. 7 people were destroyed in their own houses. The settlement was never reoccupied. Whatever the survivors of the surrounding region understood about that place, they understood it well enough to leave it empty. And that is the detail that resists every attempt to explain it away as hunger. Starvation cannibalism is desperate, hurried, indifferent to symbolism. It does not stop to defecate in a hearth. The hearth was the center of the household, the fixed point around which a family organized its life. To leave human waste in it, waste containing the remains of the people who had lived there, is not consumption. It is a statement. The message was aimed at anyone who came back to look. Nobody came back. The object itself is unremarkable. A single dried gray-brown lump, light and crumbling, sitting in a hearth full of cold ash. It was the least impressive artifact in the entire excavation, easily mistaken for a clod of sediment, and it outlasted the roof, the pots, the people, and the memory of whatever grievance produced it. 800 years later, it was still there, in the ashes, exactly where it had been placed, waiting. The version of prehistory that reaches the public is clean. Flint tools arranged on white cloth in glass cases, cave paintings lit from below, the ochre bowls glowing against black rock. Reconstructed roundhouses, with the smoke drawn tidily out through the thatch. It is a version assembled from the objects that survived because they were beautiful, or durable, or both, and it flatters the people who made them. The real version is parasites. Plaque, rancid fat sealed in a wooden keg and forgotten in a bog. Bodies taken apart and put back together wrong. Every discipline has a bias built into what it can recover, and archaeology's bias runs toward permanence. Stone endures. Gold endures. But the things that tell the truth about a life are soft and wet and almost always gone. Monuments record what people wanted remembered. Filth records what actually happened. A pyramid tells you what a king believed about himself. A coprolite tells you what he ate, what lived inside him, and whether he was dying. That is the strange logic running through all 10 of these objects. The chewed pitch, the tartar, the stomach contents, the stitched skin, the worked skull, the lump of dried waste in a cold hearth. Every one of them survived for the same reason. Nobody thought it was worth destroying. Nobody curated it. Nobody buried it with honors or hid it from enemies. It was discarded, excreted, abandoned, or left behind in a hurry, and the cold or the acid or the dry cave dust did the rest. The people who made the beautiful things are gone, and their intentions with them. What remains is the residue they never meant to leave. It is the most honest record we have of human prehistory, and it is repulsive, and it is still coming out of the ground. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.